Hello. In chess, the strongest piece is the queen. The weakest ones are the pawns. But what about if one player gets all his pawns and the opponent only gets his queen? Who will then win? Why not try out the mini-game Queen versus Pawns to find out? What you do is that you put out the pawns on the second rank like this, and you put out a queen on d8. White starts this game, and white will win if one single pawn reaches the other side, rank 8. That means that if we have white to play in this position, white plays the pawn to c8, the game is over immediately. It doesn't matter that the queen can take the pawn like this in the next move, because the game is already over. So, when you play, and of course the queen will win if the queen takes all the white pawns. As always, when I give you these kind of mini games, I have a little bit of a pedagogic idea playing this game. In our case, it's about learning how the queen moves and the pawn moves, but also to have a great strategy for the queen and for the pawns. I will therefore give you some hints how to think when you play with the different pieces. We start with the queen. The queen is fantastic in threatening two things at the same time to execute a double threat. In this position, how can the black queen threaten the both pawns at the same time? There are two possibilities. First, black can play queen to d4, threatening the c4 pawn and the f2 pawn like this. But black can also play the queen to h4, threatening the pawn like this on c4 and the f2 pawn like this. So you can see the queen is great, threatening two things at the same time. Now, time to discuss a little bit about the possibilities for the pawns. The first thing that the pawns should try to do is to cover up each other, to build a chain. And what do I mean with that? Here we have four pawns standing on the fourth rank like this, and the queen is threatening the g4 pawn, and that's why white moves it forward. Then the other pawns behind on h4 and f4 is covering it from being taken. Let's say that black continued to threaten pawns. Then white move forward, and it's like a chain that white is building up with the pawns like that, and it's not so easy for the black queen to threaten them. Black queen is continuing to try to take a white pawn, but now white can play e6. And the idea is, of course, that if the black queen will take on h4, then the e pawn can move forward and will reach e8 and white wins. So black has to cover up this possibility, but now again we can see this great chain of pawns that white has got. White has made progress, the chain has moved forward. This is a strategy to use if you play with the pawns. Beside that, there is one other thing you should think of. It's enough to have one single pawn reaching the other side. That means that you can make sacrifices to come ahead, come high up on the board with the pawns, because then it might be difficult for the queen. In this position, of course, white can cover up his pawn on g5 with h4, so the black queen cannot take it. But instead, what white played was to move forward the b pawn to b6, because now if the black queen takes on g5, then the pawn moves forward, and in the next move the pawn will reach b8 like this, and white wins. Instead, in this position, again the black queen has to cover up this possibility, and now again white could play a5 covering up the pawn on b6, but instead moving forward on the other side with g5 to g6, because again if the black queen takes on b6, then the pawn reaches g7 and g8 and white will win. So two strategies for the pawns. One is to build a chain of the pawns, And the other one is to run as high up on the board as you can, because then you put the queen into difficulties because it cannot let the pawns reaching the other side. Now I would like to show you what a game can look like when you play a queen versus 8 pawns. First of all, black is threatening to take the d2 pawn, so white plays d3 to cover this up. Now it's time for black to try to use this with double threat, and maybe black plays the queen to d5, threatening both on g2 and a2, like this. White plays e4. That means that the black queen cannot reach g2, but still there is one pawn hanging on a2. The white idea is to run forward in the center with pawns as high up on the board as possible. Black takes pawns. Now it's a bit dangerous already for black because the white e-pawn has reached quite high up. And if black now gets greedy like this, like in this game, the white pawn reaches e6. And now black really has to take care of this pawn because otherwise e7 and e8 will happen and white will win. So black played queen to e2, but now with f5, white did build a chain, and it's not possible for the queen to take off any of the white pawns on d3 and g2 because then e7 might come. Black tried to cover up with queen e5, but white just moved forward because again, if the black queen takes on d4 or on f5, the e-pawn will move forward like this. And then in the next move, the white reaches the 8th rank and white will win. So instead, black tried to cover up like this, but now white just moved on. It's got a great chain. The pawns are covering up each other, and it's not possible for the queen to take any of the pawns because then the e-pawn moves forward. So black tried to cover up. White continued to move on a new pawn into the game with g4. A new part of the chain was built. Black tried to cover up with queen d8, but now like this, but with h4. After queen took the pawn, the d-pawn could move forward, and now it's really problematic because now the pawn is one step from reaching the 8th rank. Black tried to cover up with queen to d8, but after e7, one of the pawns will reach the 8th rank and white will win like this. This is a typical game when the queen gets too greedy. It must take care of the pawns earlier on than this. It's time to make a summary. When you play queen versus pawns, you put the white pawns on rank 2, you put a black queen on d8, white starts the game. The pawns win if one single pawn reaches rank 8. The queen wins if it takes all the pawns. Yeah. Just start playing. It's very nice to play this little game. Also, for a little bit more advanced players, it's not easy to play it correct. Bye!